Coming to you from the shores of sparkling Lake Michigan, welcome to the National Writers Series, celebrating 15 years as a year-round book festival. We are the premier home for passionate readers who love inspiring conversations with best-selling and award-winning authors. Tonight, we welcome biographer Lance Richardson and the featured book True Nature, The True Pilgrimage of Peter Matthiessen. In True Nature, Lance Richardson reconstructs the full scope of a spiritual quest that ultimately led Matthiessen, even as he inflicted great pain on his family, to the highest ranks of Zen. Richardson illuminates how the writer's uncanny gifts enabled him to sense connections between ecological decline, racism, and labor exploitation. Richardson previously published House of Nutter, The Rebel Tailor of Savile Row, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and a 2018 notable title selected by The Sunday Times, The Mail on Sunday, Esquire, and the American Library Association. He is a professor for the MFA writing program at Bennington College, Vermont. Richardson will be joined in conversation with Doug Stanton, a #1 New York Times bestselling author of In Harm's Way and 12 Strong. Doug is an alum of Interlochen Arts Academy and co-founded the National Writers Series in 2009 with his wife Anne and attorney Grant Parsons. The National Writers Series salutes our amazing audiences, dedicated volunteers, and generous supporters for helping us raise the next generation of readers and writers through our free education programs across the region. This season of amazing authors is made possible through major support by the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology Group, Gold and Fowler Home Furnishings, West Shore Bank, and Traverse City Tourism. Tonight's live streaming is exclusively underwritten by Nancy Davey. Thanks to our major media sponsor, the Traverse City Record Eagle, and our media partner, Interlochen Public Radio. For information on future events, programs, and how to support our nonprofit work, please visit nationalwriterseries.org. Now please welcome National Writers Series co-founder Doug Stanton.
Hello, Lance Richardson. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here, Doug. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing just fine. We're really honored to have you here in the National Writer Series digital stage. We've just started a new subscription service for all those listening from around the U.S. Come to the website and join it if you like. And tonight we're going to talk, Lance, about your new epic biography of a person I think has long deserved the spotlight that you've put on him. That is Peter Matthiessen. For those watching tonight who don't know Peter yet, and they will after they read your book, who is he?
Right. This is the million-dollar question that took me 700 pages to answer. But he's one of those people who did so many different things in so many different areas that he can be very hard to pin down. And when he was alive, he had all of these critics and journalists sort of coming up with the kind of poetic descriptions to try and describe him. So he would be called a Thoreau on the road, or a cross between Solzhenitsyn and Scott of the Antarctic. But I think the easiest way to think about him is to think in three prongs of his working life. So he had the novels. He was a very, very good fiction writer and sort of wrote very sort of avant-garde fiction about the natural world and about people in various sort of parts of the world. He was a naturalist, and he was at the forefront of the modern environmental movement. And he was also a Zen Roshi. He sort of ascended to the highest ranks of Zen and became a teacher and had a Zendo on his own property. So those are the three areas of his life that really defined who he was and sort of the work that he did. Novels, nature writing, and sort of Zen spirituality.
When people think about Peter, what book do you think they might most grab onto? Or what's he most known for?
Well, they probably grab onto the book that I initially grabbed onto, which is The Snow Leopard. I think that's very, very much his most famous book. So that book is about an expedition that Matthiessen took in 1973 with a very well-known field biologist named George Schaller. And Schaller was doing a research project at the time on sheep and goats around the Himalayas. So he wanted to go and examine this kind of species that was sort of ambiguous whether or not it was a sheep or a goat, called the Barrel. And he wanted to go and see it in a very remote part of Nepal called Dolpo. And he knew it was going to be an epic journey, and he would sort of get lonely doing it. So he invited his friend Matthiessen, and they'd met in the Serengeti previously, to come along on this journey. And Peter jumped at the opportunity because he really liked George. He wanted to work with George. He thought it would be a great story. It would be an opportunity for him to sort of deepen his practice in Buddhism, which at the time was still relatively new to him. His wife had also recently died of cancer, so he saw it as sort of a tribute to her, a way to kind of mourn her. And he also just saw it as an opportunity really to go on a spiritual journey himself. So it was at the same time a wildlife expedition, but also a sort of spiritual pilgrimage. He went on this in 1973, and then afterwards he wrote the book for 5 years, and it came out in 1978, and it won the the National Book Award twice actually. It won it for paperback as well. So that is very much the book that he's most famous for. Much to his chagrin, in a way, because he thought his novels were really his crowning achievement. He really wanted to be known as a novelist. And I found that kind of astounding because, as a writer myself, and all the writers I know, like to have written something as exceptional as the Snow Leopard, I think most writers would be delighted to have that on their resume, right? And then for Peter, it was actually kind of an albatross for him in his mind.
That picture we just threw up, can we see that again? Is that possible? He's on a. Did you see it? He was on a mountaintop. It looks like he was on his expedition.
Yeah. So
We'll get there
the picture, if we can.
That's okay. We'll go. What I want to do is I want to figure out how Peter Matthiessen there he is, where he started in life, how he came to stand on that mountaintop, which, as you point out, is a mythical journey. It's an arduous physical journey. I think you write somewhere in the book that he went there to shed his ego, or was attempting to. So, but let's start at the beginning. Right? What was that ego that maybe he wanted to free himself from? Where did he come from? He was born in the East Coast into extreme privilege. Is that correct? And then go through.
He was born. Points. He was born in New York City in 1927 into a very wealthy family. He grew up in Irvington, which is a commuter suburb just above Manhattan. He spent some time living in Manhattan as a child. He went to school at St. Bernard's on the Upper East Side. And then the family moved to Stamford, Connecticut, or just north of Stamford, Connecticut, and they had a sort of country estate. And they would go for summers on Fisher's Island, which is just off the coast of Connecticut. And it was a very sort of privileged, cloistered, upbringing. He had access to extraordinary nature, but at the same time, the WASP world that he grew up in was sort of very socially constrained. He felt like he was under a lot of pressure from his parents to be a certain type of person. And he really resented that. He grew up to resent that. He was Sorry, Doug, I missed you there.
Do you see the picture there? What is Peter? Which one is Peter in this photograph we're looking at?
Yeah, so this is actually on Fisher's Island. So Peter is the one sort of sitting on the edge of the boat near his sister. So he's on the right, and the other little boy is his brother Kerry, and that is his father. And they're on Fisher's Island. He looks like he's I would say about 7, and that boat is actually the site of a formative experience for him. So his father really wanted to test their swimming lessons, and there was this incident that he could never really shake, and burned into him, where his father took them out off the edge of Fisher's Island and basically told them to jump and swim. He wanted to see how they could swim. And the area of the ocean that they were in was an area that Peter called the blue water. Excuse me, because it was sort of an ambiguous. He couldn't really see the bottom, and his imagination kind of took hold of him, and he sort of imagined all these sea monsters, and he really didn't want to get in the water. And his father picked him up and basically threw him over the edge of the boat. And in the memoir notes that Peter left behind, he really pointed to this as this sort of like primal trauma that he had invested, whether or not it actually was, he had invested it over the years with really all the resentment he felt towards his parents. And it kind of
Hmm.
it came to loom so large in his mind that, in the 60s when he was doing LSD, I've got an LSD journal where he sort of describes the pain in the hand that came back from when he was thrown over the edge of the boat and hit his hand on the way into the water. So it really was kind of this formative moment. And that's why I love that photo, because I feel like it really speaks to that.
So you just said something so interesting, Lance, here for us. The LSD journal that he had, and that you were able to access it as his biographer. I want to get to that in just a moment because not
Yeah.
everyone keeps a journal. It's really fascinating. The tension he
But you
has
mean
with his
you
folks.
don't
And
have an LSD journal, Doug? I mean,
I don't know. I have a Tylenol journal, but that's about it. Yeah. Um, the tension he feels with his parents, who are depressive, right? Stuffy,
mhm.
waspy. He's very aware of his waspiness, as he says. He goes to Yale because his father went to Yale. So this tension just seems to follow him through his whole life about who am I,
Right.
who am I, and who do I want to be. There's almost two Peters. There's a doppelganger, a twin. I'm kind of speaking very freely here, just remembering your fabulous biography. Um, and his life seemed to be an effort to conjoin those to become the whole one person. Would you agree with that? And so what we have is this.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Go ahead.
I would say even more than just conjoining. He really believed, he had a sense that there was an original self, or a self that we all have as children, this innocent kind of original self. And over the years, and I should say that original self basically doesn't differentiate between the self and the outside. So, children don't necessarily, he says at one point in his work, they don't see a difference between them and the stars in the sky or the leaves or anything like that. It's just everything's kind of flows. And he sort of saw this really as the primal state, as the original self. And over time, as you get older, as your parents put expectations on you, as you become a member of society, you really kind of get encrusted over with ego, with a sense of self, with obligations and everything like that. And he really wanted to strip all of that away. This was this sort of the journey of his life, to try and find a way to peel all that back and to get to the original self that was, he believed, within always, this sort of child that was within the man. And that anyone who kind of practices Zen, a lot of what I just said would sound familiar. I think it's not necessarily a terribly unusual thing to believe that, you are innocent as a child and then you lose that innocence and you want to get that innocence back. I think a lot of people feel like that. And so in that way, Peter really just took something that I think a lot of people have, but he took it to absolute extremes. And his journey
Hmm.
was really an extraordinary example of that.
Of extremes, of a sense of heightened awareness of oneself, but yet also, as you write in the biography, and as some reviewers have pointed out, by the way, you had a fabulous piece in the New Yorker recently, which I encourage everyone to pick
I
up as
didn't
well.
write it, but yeah, it's a
Yeah,
great
yeah, no,
piece.
you were the author, Maggie Doherty, really put Peter Matthiessen under a lens, which is fascinating. And as well, Terry McDonald, Peter's former editor at one point, wrote a
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
great piece, which I encourage viewers to go to in Alta Magazine online. And both of those pieces really supplement what you've written here, and they both complement you greatly. We're going to take some questions a little later, but so as you're watching, if you want to think about what you might ask here, um, how does we're kind of skipping over the obvious, which is that Peter Matheson is not a hippie quote per se, in the sense that people were in the '60s. He didn't drop in and tune in and whatever. You know what I mean? He's really leading the way early. He's in
Absolutely,
Paris,
yeah.
yeah, and
Well, let me sort of like, the I guess I could pose the question, how did he get to Zen? Because that was the
yeah.
ultimate destination for him. And the way he got to Zen, he gave a talk in the early 60s, the early 70s rather, after his second wife had died. And he really sort of charted for his listeners his sort of journey up to that point. And he talks about what he called the way, or these ways. And he was looking for, as I said, a way to kind of peel back to find the original self, to sort of understand himself in relation to the world. And his first, what he called the first way, was in the late 40s. He was in Paris, having a year abroad, and he encountered Gurdjieff, the mystic. The sort of, it's a very interesting system of thought that Gurdjieff had, and it involved like this sort of dance, these type of movements that was a sort of meditation. And Matthiessen was really kind of enchanted by that, and he sort of he went along with that for a while. He was really invested in it. He saw this as maybe a kind of pathway to understanding himself. But after a while, he decided that it was too complicated, too esoteric, and he dropped it. And so that was the first way, that was gone. And the second way was, I mentioned before, LSD. And I think, a lot of people think of LSD and you think of like hippies or something, but when Matthiessen came to it in the early 60s, it was still being used by serious scientists, by people who were looking at kind of medical applications for it. And Matthiessen came to it very much as a type of therapy, as a way of exploring himself. And he kept a journal, as I mentioned, and he worked on it with his wife and with a doctor. And he took it multiple times, and he was trying every time to sort of peel back more and more and to get back to this original self. And he would write in his journal what he discovered and what he felt. And he was doing that for a couple of years. He did it many, many times. And this is like right on the forefront of LSD. And he was doing it even after it became sort of illegal, and which is 1966. He was still doing it. But what happened is his wife, Deborah, who was doing it with him, kind of really struggled with it. She couldn't have an experience that wasn't basically enshrouded in paranoia. So she dropped it. She didn't want to do it anymore. So she started looking for a replacement, and she found tea ceremony. And through tea ceremony, she found Zen. And this is sort of 1967, 1968. Zen is, known in America because of things like the Dharma Bums, Kerouac, the Beats, but not necessarily known as a practice. The idea of actually sitting down and doing Zazen was mostly unknown. But Deborah encounters it through tea ceremony, through Zen. Yeah.
What is Zazen? What is Zazen for those of us?
Zazen is the practice of sitting meditation. So you sit with your legs folded. If you are very flexible, I am not, but you can sit in lotus with your legs kind of like entangled, like a yogi, and you basically try and clear your mind. And you do that for an hour, multiple hours, depending on the type of thing. If it's a session, it can be days. And this is sitting meditation. Zazen means sitting meditation. So Deborah, his wife, kind of encountered this, and she really got invested in it. And to the point where it took over her life. She thought, I found it, this is it. And then through Deborah, Peter came to Zen, and he really embraced it. And the irony is he embraced it at the moment that she died. And really her death in some ways pushed him even further into Zen. And once he found Zen, which was the third way, the ways I mentioned, that was really it. And he spent the rest of his life, multiple decades, really practicing Zen, refining his practice, and ultimately ascending to the rank of Roshi. His name was Murio Roshi, and he had his own students. But that became the backbone of his spiritual life, really.
Could we see photo 8 of Peter Matthiessen and Deborah Love, and then photo 13? Photo 14, I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah, that's
Who
Deborah.
is Deborah? Yeah, who is she?
Yeah, so
Lance?
Deborah Love is an extraordinary figure and a very, very good writer. She also wrote a book herself about their marriage, actually. And if you read it in conjunction with the Snow Leopard, it makes it an extraordinary kind of double bill, a glimpse into the sort of he said, she said of this marriage. But she came from St. Louis, from a background not unlike his, very privileged, and she really rebelled against the trappings of that. She, the debutante balls and all that sort of thing, the expectation that she'd make a dutiful wife. She didn't buy any of that. She didn't want any of that. So she was more of a kind of bohemian radical than Peter ever was, but she was so beautiful and so enchanting that, he fell for her and they married, but it was a very kind of difficult marriage in the sense that they were both very strong-willed people. She wanted the freedom to write herself, and Peter kind of had expectations that she would run the house while he was off doing it, while he was off writing and sort of traveling. So it was a very complicated marriage that they had.
Peter Matthiessen had some very, in some ways, old-fashioned ideas of the relationship between people in a marriage. And you talk about that quite a bit in the book.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. One of the things you're complimented on so much in this biography is the way you're able to dig into in a very insightful, sensitive manner to the relationship he had with the three important women in his life. Um, um, he he starts with Deborah there. Now, that's what year is that? 70, 68,
No,
probably?
Deborah died in 1972. So that photo was probably taken, I'd say, about 1966, 1965. That would have been
Okay.
taken. So they
Could we see,
encountered each other in 1961.
could we see photograph 14? So
Mhm.
take us from that portrait with Deborah Love, who initiated this search of Peter's, and tell us what's going on here in this photograph.
Yeah, so this is a photo that was taken in 1980. And so he has been practicing Zen. He really kind of embraced Zen. He was sort of dabbling with it in sort of 1970, 1971, but he really embraced it in 1972. So this is about 8 years into his practice. And this is called Takudo, and this is a home leaving ceremony. So this basically is him becoming a monk and saying he's dedicating his life to the path of Zen. And just after this photo was taken, he would have had his head was shaved. So in some of the other photos from this ceremony, he's completely shaven. And he's really this is a formal commitment to the practice. What's kind of ironic is that it came, mere months after his wedding to his third wife. And the figure in the middle there that you see sitting down is Meizumi Roshi. That was his teacher. And Meizumi told Maria, his third wife, at one point that Takudo was actually more important than a marriage. So that's kind of a hint there of the complexity, for his wife, that she had to juggle this almost like this other woman in the relationship, with the other woman being Zen. And the kind of difficulty of that for her was immense.
Um, it's interesting. Let's go to photo 2 if we could, because I want to. Peter Matthiessen is a person of many many lives. In fact, he wrote a book called Men's Lives, right, about commercial fishing on Long Island. But
Yeah.
here, which one is Peter? What is going on in this photo? We're going back now. We're in 1980. He's about to have his head shaved in a certain kind of initiation, and here he is in another initiation ceremony. Essentially, he's
Another
joined the
life,
Navy.
really? I thought it was a lifetime ago. Yeah. So this is actually taken in Hawaii, in Oahu, and Peter is the one holding a cigarette, or like just about to take a puff of a cigarette at the back of the table there. And he's in the Navy. It's 1945 or 1946. So he's just out of school. He's 18 or 19 in this photo here. And what happened is, he was in Hotchkiss, and he would watch as a lot of his classmates would be sort of called up ahead of him, and they'd go off to fight in the war. And he saw this as really, a badge of honor. This is what they all were doing. And he was called up, and he was literally getting trained up in Rhode Island uh, when the war ended. And there's these extraordinary letters that he wrote to his girlfriend at the time, on VE Day and things like that, where he's sort of writing about he's conflicted feelings and sort of the excitement of the war is over, but also, oh God, the war is over. Like, how am I going to prove myself now? And so he got sent off anyway, and here he is in Hawaii, but his job was to work in the laundry. And he was doing the laundry of the soldiers who were being sent home, demobilized. And he found that to be pretty humiliating, and really kind of struggled with it. And he wrote a novel about a war novel called Raditzer, where he gives his character a lot of the same things that he went through and a lot of the resentments that he felt. And yeah, so that photo is a much earlier iteration of Peter than the previous one we just looked at.
He's so interesting because if you were music, for instance, you would go from the highs to the double bass notes. I mean, he really
Yes.
runs the span of, but all of it is coalesces around this idea, I think, of proving oneself, of finding
Mhm.
oneself, and then truly
Let me just
living
say, Doug,
one's.
let me just jump in there. Can I just say, like, about it seems so different in a way, what we just looked at, those two photos. They seem so totally different. But what that photo doesn't show is that not long before that was taken, when he was on the troop ship that was crossing over from Treasure Island near San Francisco to Hawaii, he had a moment, he had an experience that was really one of the most important experiences of his life, where he was doing fire watch. He was up on the deck, and there was water smashing over the sides of the boat. And he had an
Mhm.
experience where he felt like he was he says obliterated by the waves, what we would call a mystical experience. And he called it an opening. In Zen, they would call it kensho, which means sort of an opening. It means an awareness of oneself, the true self. And that was really kind of the first experience that he had, where he sort of had a moment where he glimpsed the ultimate destination that he wanted. He glimpsed that version of himself where he had stripped everything back and was this original person that he wanted. So even, in that photograph where he looks just like, a young man kind of goofing off with his pals in the Navy, he's still got this kind of spiritual search that's going on in the background, and that would ultimately lead him to that other photo we just saw, of him, committing to Zen. So even then it was already happening.
Could we see photo 4 and 5?
Hmm.
Because I bring this up, Lance, because you're talking about he's emerging here. What tell us what's going on in this photo.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Yeah, so this is Paris here. That's the Notre Dame in the background. And
Yep.
this was taken in 1951 or 1952. So this is a couple of years after the Navy. He's a bit older. He's just finished at Yale, and he really didn't know what to do with his life. He's sort of casting around. He knew he wanted to write, but he didn't know how he was going to actually make that into, a career. And what happened is, at Yale, he finishes up, and he's doing, an extra semester where he's teaching undergraduates. He's running a seminar about creative writing. And one of his professors sort of taps him on the shoulder and says, do you want to do something for your country, basically? And what he's doing is he's recruiting Matthiessen into the CIA, which at that time was fledgling, was brand new, had evolved from the OSS. And Matthiessen really was pretty apolitical. He had some sort of left-leaning ideas, but really hadn't thought things through. He was pretty unformed. And he jumped at the idea because, not because he wanted to really do something for his country, but because they were offering him an opportunity to go and live in Paris, which was a city he'd already lived in for a while and loved, with a salary or with a stipend that would give him the resources to just really focus on writing and to write the novel that he wanted to write. So he saw this as an opportunity to go to the city he wanted to be in, to do the thing he wanted to do with his new wife, Patsy Southgate, his first wife. And so he said yes. And he went to Paris and worked for the CIA as an undercover agent. So he's in that photograph. He's basically he's a spook there. And here's the Paris Review, which is the magazine that was created at the time he was there, partly as a cover for him. So what happened is, he went to Paris. He starts working on his novel, and as anyone who knows a writer or is a writer, the labor is pretty invisible. You look most of the time like you're not actually doing anything, that you're just sitting in a room doing nothing. And that's not very good cover for a spy, to look like you're not doing anything. So he's in Paris
Yeah.
with his new wife, and his cover is not very strong. So he got told that he basically needed to find something else to do, to strengthen his cover, so he could keep doing what they wanted him to do. And his solution was he met another American in a cafe, Harold Doc Humes, who was working on a magazine at the time. And Harold, he said to Harold, "Why don't we just, flick off this bad magazine that you're working on and create a new one?" And Doc said, "Okay, let's do it." And they called up a friend who was living in England at the time, Cambridge, named George Plimpton. Is probably a name that some of the listeners might know. And Plimpton came over, and they started this magazine that became the Paris Review. And for Peter, it was a cover. So he was very passionate about it. He was very serious about the fiction. So it wasn't an excuse. He was dedicated to it. But in terms of his other work, it gave him plausible deniability of why he was there, and so he could keep doing what he was doing in the background.
You write in your biography that in 1977, the New York Times essentially outs this
Hmm.
situation, if I have it right. And I'm wondering how Peter responded to that. This is a long time ago now. But I do want to point out
Mm.
too that you finally get to the bottom of this. Many people watching this right now probably had no idea that the Paris Review was actually involved in the post. It was part of the Cold War.
Very much cultural propaganda. I never found any evidence that that was the case with the Paris Review itself. The Paris Review was much more, it gave Peter the cover to do the things that he was doing on the side. Um, so, and now I've lost my train of thought. What did you say? What was your question, Doug? I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the internet
No, no, you're
wobbled here.
good. You're good.
My point was the magazine, the Paris Review, had never been directly funded by the CIA. You get to the bottom half
Yeah,
of your biography. You start to clear this up because
as
I,
much as
when
possible, as much as possible.
yeah, you do. Um, we were fortunate enough to have Peter Matthiessen as a guest at the National Writer Series in 2010, actually almost 15 years ago to this week, and we spoke a bit about this, and he was stiff about it. I wouldn't say it was prickly, but it was hard. I want everyone to think for a moment. Here's the man shaving his head. He's now a Zen Roshi. Here's the man taking LSD, and what he thinks of it. I think he told Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, well, why wouldn't, hey, Ben, haven't you ever done something dumb like this when you were 23?
Right,
I think that's how
right,
Peter looked at it. But again, it goes to the point of who is Peter Matthiessen? Because an intelligence officer's job is to lie, is to
right.
actually live by the lie, not to find the truth, or actually is to hide the truth. It's really kind of
Right.
fascinating that he went there. So that
Yeah,
I
it's
get
also
it wasn't
fascinating
really.
why he was so tetchy about it with you. Even like so here he is, coming to speak with you in Traverse City, how many decades after all this has happened, and he's still funny about it. And that's really interesting, why he would still be funny about it. And there was a couple of reasons why he was funny about it. Partly it was because one of the duties that the CIA had him doing was keeping a tab on left-wing sort of artists and people like that, people that were his friends. He basically was spying on his friends, and I think he was ashamed of that. He says he was ashamed of that. So that was one
Mhm.
reason why he really didn't want to talk about it, because it was sort of putting a finger in this that he had. Was, the fact that he wasn't legally, he was publicly, was for him, technically a punishable offense. But the bigger one, or at least the bigger excuse that he gave, was that he did a lot of work with Native American people. And these are people who had been persecuted by the FBI, who had had kind of moles planted and all sorts of sort of, nefarious things done to them by authority figures. And he was worried that if they found out that he had been one of those people, he'd lose his credibility with these people. And so he really kind of didn't want to talk about it and sort of wanted to push it under the rug because he was worried about how they would react. And you can kind of question to what extent that is just an excuse. But that's really, one of the things that he said and really stuck to until the end about, why he didn't want to address this, because he was worried about how people like Leonard Peltier would react. And actually, there's a letter that he wrote to Leonard Peltier. So I should say Leonard Peltier, for people who don't know, was a Native American activist, a member of AIM, who was incarcerated in the 1970s for murdering two FBI agents. It's sort of ambiguous about whether he actually did it. He was just given clemency in January by Biden. So he's under house arrest now. But Matthiessen really came to his defense. But he was worried how Leonard would take it. And he wrote a letter to Leonard in about 2006, when Leonard kind of Leonard already knew about it, but Peter didn't know that Leonard knew. And something happened and it was brought to Leonard's attention. And Peter panicked and he wrote a letter saying, I just want you to know that all of this silliness that happened with the CIA in no way undermines my commitment to the cause, to you. So here we are, like decades later, and he was still really worried about it. To the point where he was writing letters to Leonard, sort of, iterating that he was, yeah, there he is there in about 2000, at a rally in New York, demanding clemency from, I guess 2000, that would have been Clinton, and was it Clinton? Yeah, it was Clinton. And he went through a series of presidents trying to get clemency. So he would have been delighted in January that Peltier eventually got clemency.
He it's hard to, when you talk about Peter Matthiessen. So this Leonard Peltier experience lasted 8 years. It was a libel suit filed right by the governor of Dakota and also the FBI. Yeah, we're suing Viking right here, this book, and Peter. That was just one thing. That was one journey in his life. The go to photograph 9, if you could, because here he is on another. Here he is as an activist again. We haven't even talked about Peter's immense influence on the environmental movement starting in the early 70s. So, but tell us what's going on here, Lance.
Yeah, so his influence in the environmental movement really would date to 1959, when he wrote Wildlife in America, which was, predated even Silent Spring. And he talks in that book about pesticides and the sorts of things that really became, hot button issues in the early 60s to trigger the environmental movement. But what we're looking at here is Peter in California, and he's talking to Cesar Chavez, who he considered to be one of his great heroes. And he wrote a book about Chavez. And he also wrote a massive 2-part piece for The New Yorker, which really was one of the first New Yorker pieces that would be considered advocacy journalism. So The New Yorker really resisted at that time, or in the years before that, anything that had the whiff of partisanship about it. It really didn't want to kind of wade into those sorts of waters. And Matthiessen had pitched stories before then that the editor had rejected as too partisan and sort of too serious. But what happened is that this is the late 60s. The editors of the New Yorker kind of realized that they couldn't pretend to be neutral anymore, or they really couldn't pretend that they weren't wading into these cultural waters. So they started to take a little bit of a sort of perspective, a little bit of a stand. And Matthiessen jumped at the opportunity to pitch this massive profile of this new leader in California who was leading California farm workers up against sort of, agricultural big business. And Peter went out there and he spent time with Chavez and was immensely moved by this man, and wrote this book in which he never pretended to be kind of an objective journalist. So this is a really big part of his legacy. He never pretended to be objective. He was very clear in his books, like South Sea Poetas, which is the book about Peltier, or In the Spirit of sorry, that's his book about Chavez, and In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, which is his book about Peltier. He was very transparent in those books that he was partisan to the cause and that he was fighting for an idea, or Peltier's freedom. So that became this huge part of his work. And he spent years of his working life basically writing what he called cause books. And he sort of, he said that almost like it was a dirty, like piece of dirty laundry. He didn't consider those books to be terribly literarily sophisticated. He sort of did it because he believed in it, not because he thought they were good work. But that became a huge part of who he was. And it really stemmed back to this idea that he had, and he would quote Camus, who said that a writer's obligation is to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And Peter really believed this. He really believed that as a writer with a platform, with an audience, it was his obligation and his duty to really speak up for causes that were important for people who had been marginalized. And he did it all through his life, right to the end. And it's sort of one of the kind of most moving and impressive parts of his legacy.
I agree, Lance. What's interesting in your biography is that he says this and he does believe it, yet you really ran into some real interesting kind of familial landmines when you went to the family to talk about what it was like to be married to Peter Matthiessen, or what it was like to be his child.
Right.
Right. They, I think, and I want you to talk about this, felt marginalized themselves in a way, right? And or without a voice
Right.
in his life. So go ahead and, I mean, talk. This is really also a question about how hard it was to write this book. What were the challenges of it, and what when you began to put this. Go ahead.
Well, there's always the challenge when you write a biography about someone who, they themselves may be past, but their family's around. And you have to negotiate what it means to write a book about somebody, which inevitably is also a book about his wife, his children. So you are writing their story as well. And every biographer who does this has to go through a process of negotiating with themselves and with the family what that means. And I did it. And I remember, the very first person I spoke to for this book was his widow, Maria. And it was November 2017. And I drove out to see her in Sag Harbor in the east end of Long Island. And I sat down with her, and she's an incredibly impressive woman. And we had tea. And I said, I think I want to write a book about your late husband. And Maria said, well, I give you permission. You're crazy because it's just this vast topic that you're taking on. But I don't want to be a part of it. And she said that because, she didn't know me. I was a stranger, and they had a very complicated marriage, and she didn't want to do an autopsy on it with someone she didn't know, which absolutely makes sense. And it really took, I'd say, 3.5 years to earn her trust, to get to the point where, through repeated visits to her house to scan photos from her albums and to talk to her, she felt that I was doing the type of job that would do justice to their marriage. So then she spoke to me, and she kind of told me really what it had been like and what had happened. And she showed me letters that she'd held back from the archive. But this is something, with biography that's maybe different to other types of writing, in the sense that sometimes you just really have to play the long game. 3 years to get really the trust of this one person who was so important to this book. But she's not the only person that was like that I had to kind of go back to repeatedly, and sort of, talk to them and discuss the angle I was taking, or the type of sort of things I was writing about, and show that I was sort of doing a book that was not a hatchet job or was not salacious and kind of obsessed with gossip.
Yeah.
And that's part of the process, and it is really difficult and really long. And I often said that I felt like I was floating in the middle of an ocean with no land in sight for years. I worked on this for 8 years, and there were moments where I wanted to jump overboard and just give up. But the thing about Matthiessen that you've kind of alluded to is that there's so many things in his life, so many different episodes, that whenever I was sort of tired of something or felt like I was hitting a brick wall, I would just I could turn to a new topic, and it would be almost like an entirely new book. I'm writing about the CIA in Paris, and then 2 chapters later, he's floating down the Amazon looking for a prehistoric skull in the Amazon jungle. So it was constantly evolving, and really a juggling act. So working with his family and his friends was sort of part of a very, very long process.
So it begs the question for me: why is Peter Matthiessen an important figure? What about him did you devote 8 years of your life to write about him? Place him
Mm.
in in a pantheon or a group of writers who come of age after World War II, essentially. What was Peter's story? What was the story he kept trying to tell?
So for me, there's several ways of answering that question. Why is Matheson important? Let me say why he's important to me, and then I'll say why I think he's important as a literary figure. To me, the thing that drew me to him, the thing that struck me about the Snow Leopard, is that in that book he writes about science and spirituality at the same time in a kind of enmeshed way. And I think we often think about science and sort of spirituality or religion or mysticism, whatever you want to call it, as sort of mutually incompatible, mutually exclusive modes of thought. And he really rejected that idea. He wanted to find a sort of syncretic way of looking at the world that really didn't sort of close himself off to any type of thought, any type of sort of knowledge system that includes sort of indigenous knowledge. He really sort of wanted to open himself up to everything and to see the world in the biggest way possible. And I found that very inspiring. And I found that, it's the type of way that I want to look at the world. I don't think science covers all of the bases, and I don't think religion covers all of the bases. And I look at various types of native thought around the world, and native people and the way that they look at the world, and it seems so much more sensible than the way we do in terms of their relationship with the natural world. So I was really inspired by the way he looked at things, and I wanted to understand how he had evolved that sensibility, and that for me was why he was so important and why I think he is important. But in terms of like the literary pantheon, there's really a couple of things. And one of them is his place in the modern environmental movement as one of the early proponents. So we often kind of talk about people like Rachel Carson, and she's incredibly important. And he was an immense fan of hers. But he was also important as well. And his early books inspired people like Barry Lopez, like David Quammen, Terry Tempest Williams. They have written to him and about him. So he is an incredibly important sort of forerunner of these figures, some of who have passed, some of who are around now, that we really kind of look to as sort of the major nature writers of the 20th century. And he also, I mentioned before his advocacy journalism, but
Mm.
it's hard to overestimate how important that type of work was. He was writing articles in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post about Native people, about land struggles, at a moment when those things weren't really being written about in those mainstream publications. He rejected the idea that it was niche, that it was not important. And he really sort of helped normalize not only advocacy journalism in general, but the idea that you cannot talk about conservation in any serious way without actually including Indigenous people in that conversation. And he insisted on doing so. So I think, the legacy that he kind of built there is something we're still seeing now in terms of advocacy journalism now being something that is often, a lot of people do it. It's still controversial in places like the New York Times, which, people there are supposed to be objective. But I think that really the legacy, the type of example that he set is one that we're still living
Mhm.
with now, and I don't think he's ever really been kind of given his due for that.
Is there a passage? Let's talk about the Snow Leopard for a moment um, as we think about Peter Mathiessen's life. Do you fond of? Would you mind reading it so we can hear the voice of that book? Um,
Yeah, so I have a copy here. This is the copy that I actually took to the Himalayas myself. I redid the Snow Leopard trek in 2022. And I'm just going to read a one paragraph here that'll give you a sense of his voice. And this is um, just to set the scene. He is at the top of a place called the Kangla, which is a pass at 17,500 feet. Monastery is. So this is the Sherpas start down immediately. They too seem oppressed by so much emptiness. Left alone, I am overtaken by that northern void. No wind, no cloud, no track, no bird, only the crystal crescents between peaks, the ringing monuments of rock that, freed from the talons of ice and snow, thrust an implacable being into the blue. In the early light, the rock shadows on the snow are sharp. In the tension between light and dark is the power of the universe. This stillness to which all returns, this is reality, and soul and sanity have no more meaning here than a gust of snow. Such transience and insignificance are exalting, terrifying all at once, like the sudden discovery in meditation of one's own transparence. Snow mountains, more than sea or sky, serve as a mirror to one's own true being, utterly still, utterly clear, a void, an emptiness without life or sound that carries in itself all life, all sound. Yet as long as I remain an I who is conscious of the void and stands apart from it, there will remain a snow mist on the mirror. So beautiful. Um, I love this book so much, even after all the years of working on this biography and learning all of his dirty his dirty laundry. I still am so moved by this book.
what moves you, Lance? How did writing this book change you?
I mean, what moves me is just the beauty of the language there is extraordinary, and as I was saying before, this sort of this science and spirituality in this book is so
Mm.
palpable to me. But I'm particularly moved by it because I went there and I did this trek, and so I read this book now, and it's like reliving the most extraordinary thing I've ever done in my life, walk to the Crystal Monastery, and uh, to be immediately transported back to Dolpo into that space, which is so vivid to me and so exactly like he describes it. It's really uncanny. We took, as I said, we took this book with us when we went there, and we would sit down in the evening and read the passages that were describing what we had just walked through, and it was just truly astonishing sometimes. There was one point in that photo that you can see there where I'm sitting on the steps near a lamasery. Inside there, there's a room that he describes in the book, and he describes the pots on the shelf, and those pots are still there. Like it was unbelievable. It was really something.
Talk about this. You open your biography with the idea that you might not make it. You're at 17,000 plus feet, right? And you have
Yeah.
pulmonary edema, which is serious, and so you've got to come down off the mountain. Um,
I have
why did
symptoms that the doctor later said suggested that on the early onset of pulmonary edema, but we did make it to the monastery. So the high point, which is the passage I just read, the Kangla, 17,550 feet. By the time we got there, I was coughing uncontrollably, and there was blood in my nose. I was in a pretty bad state. So we get to the monastery, which is just over the mountain. And we spent a night there, and through that night, I couldn't sleep for more than 5 minutes without coughing. And my expedition partners that were there in other tents, they were listening to this, and the man Gavin Anderson, who really kind of mounted this expedition, the next morning at breakfast, he said, "No, we've got to get out of here.
mm,
You've got to get to a lower altitude." So we sort of very quickly left. which in one way was devastating to have got there and to leave so quickly. But in another way, there's sort of a poetry about like just glimpsing it and then kind of having it snatched away that I can now see. Although at the time it seemed very bittersweet. But it's still, even with the health problems, was still the most extraordinary thing I've ever done.
Okay, let's go there for a moment. Well, I mean, obviously it's extraordinary, and to be in that
Mm.
space at that altitude among that culture. But you said something interesting. You at least had a glimpse of the place in a way,
Yeah,
and
right. So let me unpack that. So for Peter, he had this idea of finding an island. He called it an island. And he didn't necessarily mean a physical island. He meant a space, a state of being where, as I said earlier, he could strip away those sort of layers of himself and be a child, be innocent, be his sort of pure self. And this island that he wanted to find was a space where he could be that original self, that sort of pure, kind of untarnished version of who he used to be as a child. And really, he found several islands through his life where he glimpsed this state of being. But really, the kind of most important one and the most sustained one was Shea Gompa, was the monastery that he writes about in the Snow Leopard. So he spent a couple of weeks there, and they were really some of the happiest weeks of his life, just being in this space on the cusp of winter, looking at the blue sheep, looking for wolves, looking for snow leopards, and just meditating on the side of a mountain and just being in this space of snow and ice, and rock, this sort of elemental landscape. Um, and I wanted to understand what that felt like. I wanted to really kind of get a sense of what it meant for him to be in one of those islands. And so when I got there, and even though I was only there fleetingly, I felt it. I understood why this place was so important to him and so kind of transcendent, because it really is, you know, it's hard to describe. It's really, you feel like you're at the absolute kind of edge of the atmosphere. It's so high up there, and
well,
it's really kind of a magical place. And so just to
I,
be there, even briefly, to glimpse, the state that he had was so important to me. Yeah.
I know that we have some video of this of this. Let's roll that right now and watch because it's really fascinating. Um, Wow. Are those buildings on the side of the mountain part of the Snow Leopard?
Yeah. Yeah, so the lingering shot of there's is drone footage where you come over the valley filled with fog, and you can see in the distance on a little hillside, you can see this little gathering of buildings. That is the monastery. That is, and then it cuts to the close up of the monastery that you can see it. So that is where they were going. And earlier in the footage there, where you saw the two figures, one of them was me, on that kind of ridge of snow. That is the Kangla.
Hmm.
So that is the very, very high point that I just read from the Snow Leopard. Peter was up there. So everything that you saw in that little film there is stuff that in the Snow Leopard is described. But that valley filled with fog, which is so incredible to see that is the place. That is Shea Gompa, the Crystal Monastery.
Hmm. If you had been able to meet Peter Matthiessen, because he passed away in 2014, is that right?
Mm, he
What would
did,
you?
yeah. What would I ask him? I got asked this question the other day, and it's really funny. There's there's so many things that I want to know, but the question that I would ask, and it seems so silly, I think, in a way, but um, I really want to know his code name during the Paris years, because he left behind as a biographer, I want these specific details, and he left behind a memoir, this sort of this compilation of notes about what he was doing there, and there's a point in the notes where he almost writes his code name, and he leaves a space, and then he just keeps going. So he's like thinking about whether or not he's going to write it in there, and he doesn't write it in there. And the CIA won't declassify personnel records. So they won't give it to me, and I just want to know what it is. And it's just it's not really very meaningful, but I don't know. It just plagued me for 8 years wanting to know the answer to this question. So that's what I would ask. Yeah.
But okay, if you know, what would you know if you knew that answer, though? It's interesting. I mean, what?
I mean, me being an OCD biographer, wanting to make sure I got all of my details as correct as possible. I mean that it doesn't really add anything. I guess what I would ask on a sort of more substantive level is how he really how he justified treating his wives as he did. How he felt about the way he treated Deborah or Maria, and how he justified it to himself, because I think he treated them really horribly. And there's so many books about the great men of the 20th century, particularly great writers, and these biographies and these books really tend to take the side of the writer and sideline the women, push them into the background. And a conscious decision I made when I was writing this book is that I wasn't going to do that, that I was going to make sure that each of these women, these three wives, had an opportunity to be their own person, to speak as much as they had left their record behind, or Maria still, alive and could speak to me, to really kind of let them have their say, and not to push them into the background, to show that they were equal partners in this relationship. And people that had their own agency, their own desires and wishes, and they weren't completely subservient to him. And so I would really ask him about that. I want to know more about how he could rationalize the way he treated them.
Do you have any thoughts about what his answer might be, given all that you've spent, you've been inside him in a way,
Yeah.
inhabiting him?
I'm sure he would make up excuses and sort of say, I didn't treat them that badly, or like, it was a mutual thing. We treated each other badly. I'm sure he would try and fob it off, as he did in his lifetime. Or he would say that he was just, that it was a failing, and he would kind of own it to some extent. He went through periods of saying no, he didn't do it, and then owning it. So I don't think he would be able to really answer it in any sort of meaningful way. But it's an enigma how someone, especially someone who was, a Roshi, was a Zen figure, was this figure of spiritual authority, who could then turn around and treat people so cavalierly, is sort of a paradox that haunts his biography, haunts this biography, and it's insolvable, really. It's a
I have to
koan.
say, though, Reading True Nature, your biography of Peter Matthiessen, it and the fact that you go there makes it such an incredibly strong book, but also makes Peter seem more real, more authentic. He's obviously, we see him as a truly flawed human being.
Right.
Um, uh, and it's entirely refreshing. The female voices that emerge in your narrative are really some of the best parts of the biography in the way that they're candor it's really quite You're exactly right. The great white male writer post World War II never really gets, um, you know, they often don't get their due when they might deserve it. So,
Right. Right. Yeah, and
but
they're all, and the wives are really great writers themselves, and so like
yeah,
it made it a lot easier for me when the work that they left behind, the letters and in some cases books, was so incredibly vivid as well. Like my job there was pretty easy. But yeah, he was very complicated, and I didn't really want to I didn't want to shy away from that. I didn't want to excuse that. And but at the same time, I didn't want to write, this book is not a hatchet job. I am not out to get him. Um, I
no.
never once thought of this book as sort of an attack or destroying him. I never disliked him. I see him as just this very complicated man, and that in some ways becomes more interesting because of his complications.
We have just a little bit of time left. We go to a few questions that are coming through on the chat, but before we go there, I know there were lots of surprises in reporting this book. I can only imagine, but one of them for me reading it was Peter Mathiessen's early obsession with the idea of Bigfoot or the Yeti or the original human being, which you, as Terry McDonald points out in his altarpiece online, is some new scholarship in identifying that the Bigfoot um, idea or paradigm uh, led him to Leonard Peltier and other cultures. So
Right.
go ahead and just do
Right.
a Q&A talk.
Yeah, and once again, it kind of links back to the snow leopard. The snow leopard is the sort of like kind of Bible text, and everything kind of flows out of it. But when he was in the Himalayas in 1973, he became really interested in the idea of the Yeti. And the person he was traveling with, George Schaller, very serious scientist, but also open to the idea that when maybe there was an undiscovered hominid in the Himalayas, sort of this animal that had not been kind of found yet. So Peter was really interested in that and really kind of enchanted by the idea that there was maybe something out there. And he went home after 1973, and he started working on the book. He started writing it. And while he's writing this book, while he's writing material in the book about the Yeti, he gets a letter out of the blue from this man in California. And the letter says, "We have found Bigfoot." And Matthiessen is kind of sort of taken with this idea, and he answers the letter, and the floodgates open, and it takes him on this very strange journey through kind of Bigfoot mania into Native American spiritual beliefs. Um, it's a very strange path, and through that he encounters, Leonard Peltier, and through that he also starts writing about Florida. He starts writing about, the Everglades. He starts writing a novel that he labels in the earliest incarnations. He labels it his Florida BF novel, his Bigfoot novel, and you can't look at the early sort of iterations of this novel and get a sense of what it was going to be because it scraps its threads, but you can see little glimpses. It involved, a Zen hermit. It also involved a figure in the Everglades, like a white whale, a Bigfoot basically. And the other thing it involved was someone called Edgar Watson, this historical figure who lived in the Everglades, was basically a serial killer. And Matthiessen wanted to write this big tapestry that it was really kind of centered on the Bigfoot. But what happened is something that happens often in writing, that you kind of think it's one thing, but in the process of writing, it becomes something else. And the Watson thread was a strangler fig and really took over, and everything else dropped away. And then you ended up with Shadow Country eventually. I mean, I'm kind of bridging 30 years of work there. It took a really long time for him to write
Mhm.
Shadow Country. But yeah, you were right in what you said, that so many things came out of this sort of obsession. But it's something that I didn't know about when I started, and it was a real surprise to me, and a real surprise to realize how deep the rabbit hole went, and really how kind of convoluted and tangled the search for him was, and the places that it took him. But so it's a significant part of the book in a surprising way. But um,
It,
just one more
it,
episode in the crazy life of Peter Matthiessen.
it really is. I was lucky enough to see Peter Matthiessen read when I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa, and he read from Killing Mr. Watson, I believe, or from one of the
Mm.
Watson books off a legal pad in the Van Allen Auditorium, I think. And I thought at the time, I thought it was so brave. It was like watching the novel being born, because he would stop and kind of try to peer and make out his own handwriting. It wasn't typewritten. And I thought, wow, this is
Let me say, if
really,
you've seen his handwriting, that's quite a feat, because it is. I feel like I said it took me 8 years to write this book. I think 7 of them were just trying to decipher the handwriting.
oh, so you were able to access the legal pads and all that.
Everything,
Mark,
yeah, all of it.
wow. What's next for you, Lance? You've written, this is your
Oh gosh,
second.
it's my second book. Yeah, I'm really kind of still sitting with this one and just sort of letting it have its moment in the sun. But I have an idea. I have a couple of ideas for another biography.
Mhm.
I swore when this was finished, a while ago, the production process in a book like this takes a while. I swore I would never do another biography. I was done. But I sort of find that I kind of am coming around to the idea, and that I really find the process kind of energizing. I love
Mm.
being immersed in an archive. I love talking to people and traveling, and sort of piecing together the mystery of a person. It's almost like a detective searching for a missing person, and you kind of build up a profile, and I find it, pretty intoxicating. So I imagine it'll be another biography, but I don't want to
Okay.
say who I'm circling quite yet, in case I jinx the whole thing, but we'll see.
Yeah, totally understand that. The one person watching is David Atkinson, and we're kind of returning now. We're going back to the beginning of our conversation tonight, and thank you, by the way. Um, it's a question I forgot to ask. How did you pick this man to write about? I guess I glossed over that
Great,
one.
great. Well, I mean, I answered it a little bit, but let me sort of fill it out. So about 17, 18 years ago, I'm Australian initially. I'm American now, I'm naturalized, but I'm from Australia, and I was doing travel writing for the national newspaper. And a friend of mine one day gave me a beat up Penguin paperback and said, I think you should read this book. I think you'd get a lot out of this book. And it was The Snow Leopard. I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of him. And I read this book, and I was completely blown away by this book. It really struck me, but in the way that I think, sometimes we're sort of moved by a book or a film or a piece of music, and it's really hard to articulate why. You can't really sort of point to the thing about it that speaks to you. And it took a couple more readings and some real thought until I realized it was what I was saying earlier about the science and the spirituality, and the fact that he had this book is an example of an extraordinary sensibility at work. And once I sort of realized that that's what was really interesting to me, I sought his other work. I read some of his novels. And then when it came time, after I'd finished my first book, to sort of find a new subject, um, a professor who I learned a lot from once said to me that if you can talk yourself out of a project, you shouldn't do it. And I talked myself out of every idea that I had, except a book about Peter Matthiessen. So
Mm.
that's when I went and saw Maria in Sag Harbor and talked to her. But it was really the Snow Leopard for me, which was the gateway drug. I think it's the gateway drug for a lot of people who read his work. Yeah.
Who was that professor, by the way?
Gosh, it would either be Brooke Kroger or it'd be Katie Royfey. One of those two would have told me that. I learned a lot from both of them. They're NYU. They're wonderful.
Well, perhaps they're watching tonight. I'm sure they're watching your success here with the publication of True Nature, the first biography of Peter Matthiessen. And I think an amazing work. I'm going to encourage all of you. for a number of reasons we've gone over tonight to get this book. When you sit down with it, I know that I was reading, again, to go back to Terry McDonald's piece in Alta, he read it over 5 days. And I read it over maybe a little bit longer, but Lance, you open the book and you sink into it, and it's so textured and rich. I don't know how you did it. I mean, having written a lot of profiles for magazines myself, it's really about Peter, but it's about more than Peter. It's really about an American century, of which he is certainly a product, as a privileged WASP, as he calls himself, evolving into what becomes a very messy end of the century with 9/11, which he had very strong feelings about. So, and for that reason, it's a biography, but it's also it's a history of America. And thank you for being here tonight. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. I hope we get to meet in person someday, and we'll certainly have you back.
I hope so too.
All right.
Thanks so much, Doug. This has been wonderful. I've loved it.
You can get the book at your bookstore or get it at Horizon Books in Traverse City, Michigan, if you go online. So I really encourage you to do that. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from the National Writers Series. Don't miss our next live stream with New York Times bestselling author, acclaimed journalist, and professional public speaker John U. Bacon, as he explores the waters 50 years after the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald on Lake Superior. In the gales of November, Bacon presents the definitive account of the disaster, drawing on more than 100 interviews with the families, friends, and former crewmates of those lost. Tune in on November 6th at 7 p.m. or anytime after it airs with a virtual ticket. Available now at nationalwriterseries.org.